The hammer feels much heavier than Sofia expected it to be. She stands at the entrance of the greenhouse, staring at glass panels that have been clouded by 25 years of neglect, and she can feel the cold weight pulling at her arms. Richard's funeral was only 3 days ago, and the will was read just yesterday, which means she finally holds the key to everything she was never supposed to touch. The padlock on the door is thick and covered in a deep crust of brown rust. As she leans in, she notices something strange, because the lock is actually secured from the inside. It wasn't put there to keep people out, but to keep something in. Or perhaps it was always meant to keep her away from the truth. She has spent 25 years wondering what was hidden in that small room at the back of the structure. Her hand shakes as she finally raises the hammer. She can still see Richard's face from the last time she dared to ask about this place when she was only 12 years old. He had placed his hand on her shoulder with a firm and final grip before walking away without saying a single word. He never gave her an answer, leaving her with nothing but silence and a door that stayed closed for over 2 decades. The hammer finally connects with the heavy padlock. It takes 3 hard swings to do it, but on the 3rd strike, the metal shatters and sends pieces of rust flying onto the cracked concrete floor. Sofia kicks the broken remains aside and pulls the door open, letting out a rush of stale air that smells like dust, decay, and a sharp chemical scent she can't quite name. She steps into the shadows. What she finds waiting in that darkness is going to unravel every single thing she thought she knew about her father. To understand why this moment matters so much, we have to go back to the very beginning. Sofia was only 6 years old when the greenhouse became the center of her entire world. Richard built the structure himself on the far edge of their property using a simple wooden frame and glass panels that made a distinct creaking sound whenever the door opened. Inside, the space felt like pure magic, because it was filled with rows of seedlings glowing under lights and tables piled high with rich soil and clay pots. The air always smelled like damp earth and water, and Richard moved through the rows like a man who had finally found the one place where he truly belonged. He taught her how to cradle a tiny seed in her palm and how to understand exactly what the soil needed just by touching it with her fingertips. He showed her how to listen to the plants the same way other people listen to music, and by the time she turned 10, Sofia could walk into that room and know what every living thing required. It wasn't just because Richard told her what to do, but because she could feel the needs of the plants deep in her own bones. The greenhouse eventually earned a massive reputation throughout the entire region. Richard grew species that were supposed to be extinct or rare, and he raised plants that expert botanists claimed could never survive in their harsh climate. Under his care, those impossible seeds flourished into something beautiful, and people would drive from 3 towns over just to stand outside the glass and stare at his miracles. Sofia inherited that special touch completely. By the time she was a teenager, she was the one bringing dying plants back to life and understanding the soil without ever needing to run a test. She was the only person her father trusted with his most delicate work, yet there was always one part of the building she couldn't enter. At the very back of the greenhouse, tucked past the grow lights and the benches covered in pots, sat a locked room. It was a space Richard never opened while Sofia was standing there, and it was a place that belonged only to him. She asked him about it once, and then she asked him a second time, but she quickly learned that asking was a mistake. He never gave her an explanation, choosing instead to put a hand on her shoulder and lead her away as the subject was changed. The door stayed closed, and eventually, she tried her best to stop wondering what was behind it. Sofia was only 19 years old when she finally told Richard she was leaving. She wasn't just leaving their small town or the family home, but she was walking away from the entire future he had silently built for her. Richard had spent years preparing her for a quiet life in the greenhouse, teaching her how to grow rare plants in their climate-controlled sanctuary, and he never once asked if that was what she actually wanted. The acceptance letter arrived on a Tuesday, and it changed everything. It was for a competitive program in the city that focused on urban planning and environmental restoration, which was a world away from the intimate work with soil she had done since she was 6. Because she was terrified of his reaction, Sofia kept that letter hidden for an entire week while she practiced her speech. She played out every possible scenario in her head, imagining he might be angry or disappointed, or that he might actually understand why she needed to go. But what she never imagined was the cold silence that followed. She eventually found him in the greenhouse, his hands deep in the dirt as he worked with the morning seedlings. She stood there and poured her heart out about the scholarship and the opportunity to leave in the fall. But Richard didn't even look up from his work. For 30 long seconds, the only sound was the rustle of leaves until he finally stood up, wiped his hands on his jeans, and walked right past her toward the door. "Richard," she called out, using his first name because she wanted him to see her as an equal for once. He stopped at the glass door and looked at her with eyes that felt like ice, but he didn't say a single word before stepping out and closing the door between them. The consequences came fast, and within 2 weeks, a lawyer called to say Sofia had been cut out of the will entirely. The house was now promised to Julian, a nephew she barely knew who had never cared about plants or the legacy Richard spent his life building. Julian didn't see a sanctuary when he looked at the land. He saw a paycheck and a property he could develop for a massive profit. All the money Richard had saved over the decades was signed over to distant cousins who didn't even speak his language. These were people Sofia had met maybe twice in her life, yet they were getting everything, while she was officially worth nothing in her father's eyes. She tried to fix it by calling him and sending letters, but the phone just rang and the envelope stayed sealed. She even tried to come home for the holidays, but by the 3rd year the rejection became too heavy to carry. Whenever she arrived, Richard would hide away in the greenhouse, and he wouldn't come out until he knew her car had pulled out of the driveway. 25 years passed by like a door closing in slow motion, and eventually, the seal became permanent. Sofia moved on and built a successful career in the city, finding a partner and a circle of friends who actually respected her work. She had moments of real happiness and professional pride, but there was always a locked room in the back of her mind that she couldn't quite open. That all came crashing back when the lawyer called to say Richard was gone. A heart attack had taken him at 78, and it happened so fast that there was no time for a final goodbye or a moment of forgiveness. Sofia felt a strange wave of numbness, followed by a flood of grief. But she was mostly shocked that she was even invited to the reading of the will. The lawyer's office felt cold and sterile, and Sofia felt out of place sitting in a leather chair across from a man who didn't know the first thing about her father. He started reading the document in a flat, professional voice that made the destruction of her family history sound like a grocery list. Julian sat there gloating as he was handed the house and the land, which were appraised at nearly $2 million. He got the savings accounts, the car, and even the vintage tools in the shed, while the cousins, Sofia couldn't even remember, were granted $20,000 each. As the names were read, Julian kept checking his watch and smiling because he was already mentally tearing down the trees to make room for his new development. Sofia sat perfectly still and waited for a sign that her father had remembered her, hoping for a note or even a small token that explained why he had been so cruel. Finally, the lawyer flipped to the last page and read the final clause, stating that the greenhouse and the small patch of land it sat on were to go to Sofia. That was the entire inheritance, a glass structure and a frame, and nothing else. The room went silent for a heartbeat before Julian let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed off the office walls. "He really did hate you," one of the cousins whispered, and Sofia didn't even recognize the woman who was twisting the knife in her heart. While Julian was already on his phone texting developers to get demolition quotes, Sofia drove out to the old property to see what was left of her childhood. The scene was chaotic because movers were already hauling Richard's furniture out to the lawn, reducing a man's entire life to a pile of cardboard boxes and inventory stickers. She walked toward the edge of the property where the greenhouse stood, but the sight of it broke her heart. The glass panels were cracked and covered in grime, the metal frame was eaten away by rust, and every single plant inside had withered into a brown skeleton. It looked like a tomb of dead dreams, and it seemed to prove that everyone was right about it being completely worthless. Sofia started walking around the perimeter of the ruins, and that's when she spotted something that didn't make any sense. The heavy padlock on the greenhouse door was mounted on the inside of the frame rather than the outside, which was a detail she had never noticed growing up. She wondered why Richard would ever need to lock himself inside a glass building, and the weight of that lock told her he was protecting something very specific. When she saw Julian supervising the movers near the porch, she asked him if he knew anything about the strange lock. He just shrugged his shoulders and told her he didn't care because the whole thing was coming down anyway, and he asked if she wanted to take the junk before the bulldozers arrived. Sofia didn't give him an answer, but as she stared at that heavy metal lock, she realized Richard had been keeping a secret that was buried deep within those glass walls. That night, she stayed awake staring at the ceiling, knowing that the truth was waiting for her in the dust of that ruined greenhouse. Subscribe to see justice served in the next story. Sofia came back before the sun was even up. She didn't bother telling a soul where she was going. She just drove out to the property while the sky was still that deep, bruised purple, while Julian was still fast asleep, and while the world was finally quiet enough for her to actually hear her own thoughts. In the back of her car sat a heavy hammer she'd picked up at a hardware store the night before. Buying it hadn't been part of the plan, but standing there in the tool aisle, looking at those rows of cold steel, she realized she needed to break something. More than that, she needed to be the one to do it. The padlock was right where she left it, hanging there with that same coat of rust and a weight that felt like a personal insult. Sofia gripped the handle and raised the hammer, her hands finally steady after days of shaking. When the first swing connected, the crack of metal on metal echoed across the empty lot like a gunshot. The lock didn't budge. She swung a second time, much harder this time, feeling the vibration rattle all the way up her arm and into her teeth. The metal shifted just a hair. On the third strike, the lock finally gave up, fracturing into pieces that scattered across the dusty concrete. She kicked the jagged scraps aside and pulled the greenhouse door open. A wave of air hit her that smelled thick and ancient, full of dust and rot. But there was something else hiding underneath the decay. It was a sharp chemical scent that smelled like preservation, like someone had gone to great lengths to keep the outside world away. Inside, the greenhouse looked just as dead as it did from the driveway, with plants reduced to brittle brown skeletons and soil that had cracked into gray dust. But Sofia didn't stop to look at the dead ferns because her eyes were searching for something that didn't fit the scene. That was when she noticed the floor. A seam ran across the concrete in a perfect, sharp rectangle that looked far too clean to be original. While the rest of the floor was stained and pitted with age, this one section was different. It was newer and hidden so well it was almost invisible unless you were specifically looking for a secret. She dropped to her knees and found a handle sitting flush with the ground, buried under decades of grime. Her fingers brushed against the metal and it felt cold and real beneath her touch. When she pulled, the hatch lifted with a weight she didn't expect, revealing a square of pure darkness and a set of stairs that disappeared into the shadows below. Sofia didn't go down yet. Instead, she went back to the lawyer's office and told him she needed to see every last one of Richard's personal belongings. The lawyer brought out a plain cardboard box containing a watch her father never wore, a few old photos, and a heavy brass key ring. Most of the keys looked like ordinary house keys, but one was different because it was unmarked, heavy, and felt like it belonged to something important. She knew right then that this was the key to whatever was waiting in the dark. Back at the greenhouse, at the bottom of those hidden stairs, she found a door made of stainless steel. It was modern and sleek, looking completely out of place in a building from the 70s. The surface was pristine, as if it had been sealed away from the world on purpose to keep the contents safe. A small red light on a keypad beside the door blinked at her, waiting for a command. Sofia slid the key into the slot, and the light jumped from red to green as the door hissed open. A rush of cold air hit her face, but it wasn't the stale air of a basement. It was controlled and precise, the kind of air you find in a place where things are kept alive with intention. The lights flickered on automatically to reveal hundreds of shelves lined with thousands of glass jars. Each one was labeled and held something she couldn't quite make out from the doorway. Sofia took her first step inside, and in that moment, Every single thing she thought she knew about her father simply vanished. Sophia walked slowly along the rows of shelves, her eyes tracing labels written in a handwriting she would know anywhere. It was Richard's script, precise, deliberate, and careful, just like the man himself. The jars weren't filled with money or gold, but with seeds. There were thousands of them, small and dried and held in a state of perfect sleep. Each jar was marked with dates and notes that felt like a punch to the gut. Extinct, 1987. Last known sample. Species lost, 1995. Sophia read the names of plants from places she'd never visited and ecosystems she barely understood. The labels didn't just name plants. They read like a funeral service for a world that was slowly slipping away. It was a catalogue of everything that should still be here, but wasn't. On a table in the center of the room sat a leather ledger, and when she opened it, she found page after page of her father's writing. This wasn't the work of a man with a hobby, but the work of a man possessed by a mission that gave his life meaning. The dates in the book went back decades, starting long before Sophia was even born. There were notes on where every seed came from, how Richard had managed to get his hands on it, and exactly what it needed to survive. He had kept humidity logs and temperature charts for years, documenting every tiny detail with a level of care that was almost overwhelming. Some of the entries were from the years when Sophia was still by his side in the greenhouse, back when she felt loved and seen. Other notes were written during the long years of silence after she left home. The very last entry was dated just 3 months before he passed away. He never stopped. He was still out there collecting and preserving right up until his body finally gave out. At the very back of the vault sat a locked metal box, and when Sophia tried the last key on the ring, it clicked open perfectly. Inside the box were gemstones, but they weren't the kind you find in a jewelry store window. These were raw, unpolished stones in every color imaginable, including emeralds the size of her thumb and sapphires as deep as the midnight sky. Each stone came with a card that listed where it was found and what it was worth. Beneath the pile of gems, wrapped in soft paper, was a letter addressed to Sophia in her father's hand. The date on the top of the page was from 25 years ago, the exact day she told him she was leaving and never coming back. Sophia sat down right there on the cold floor of the vault and read her father's words for the first time in a quarter of a century. Richard explains that he wasn't angry when she walked away. He was actually terrified. He was scared that if he told her the truth about the vault, the responsibility would become a burden she could never escape. He didn't want her pulled into a world that could be dangerous, and he wanted her to be able to walk away from him without looking back. The seeds and the gems were never about wealth, but were meant to be a safety net and an inheritance of a completely different kind. He had built this place because he saw the world falling apart, with species vanishing and rainforests burning every single day. He knew he couldn't stop the destruction by himself, but he could save what was left so the world would have a backup system if things got worse. He locked her out of his life because he loved her too much to let her carry the weight of a dying planet on her shoulders. He kept the secret because he wanted her to choose her own path, one where she wasn't tied to the past, but was free to help the world heal in her own way. Even so, he left her the keys and the vault, giving her the one thing he never had: a choice. The letter ended with a single, simple line, where he said he was sorry he couldn't tell her and hoped she would eventually understand. Sophia stayed in that vault for hours, reading those words until the ink blurred, and she felt something inside her finally shift. The anger she'd carried for years didn't just go away, but it changed into something else. It turned into grief, then regret, and finally into a strange sense of gratitude. She understood now that Richard hadn't been hiding things from her. He had been protecting her all along. Sophia spends the entire next day documenting every single item she found in the dark. She photographs the jars of seeds, the heavy ledger, the glimmering gems, and that final letter. Methodically, she moves from shelf to shelf to capture every label and every line of Richard's cramped handwriting until her phone is completely full of images. This was a man's entire life's work, hidden away from the world, and now it was all sitting in her camera roll. She starts by looking for a botanist through an online seed preservation group and sends over the photos with a brief description. She tells them she has thousands of specimens with climate records and acquisition dates that go back decades. Then she sits by her phone and waits. The botanist calls her back in less than 2 hours, and Sofia can actually hear the woman's voice shaking before she even finishes her first sentence. "Where did you get these?" the woman asks, not even bothering to ask if they were real or if Sofia was playing a prank. Sofia tells her the whole story about Richard, the hidden vault, and the fact that she didn't even know any of this existed until 3 days ago. There is a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line before the botanist speaks again. Some of these seeds shouldn't even exist anymore because they are extinct in the wild, which makes them absolutely irreplaceable. We have been searching for some of these species for over 30 years, and we honestly thought they were gone from the earth forever. Sofia feels her throat tighten as the weight of it hits her, realizing that Richard wasn't just hoarding things in the dark. He was acting as a guardian for things the world had already lost. Next, she reaches out to a gemologist and sends over the photos of the stones she found in the small wooden boxes. Within 2 days, she receives a preliminary valuation that confirms the gems are worth a significant amount of money. It is enough to change her life, but the real value isn't in the sparkle of the stones. Richard kept such perfect records of where every stone came from that they are completely traceable and verifiable, which makes them far more valuable to a serious collector. Sofia sits with all of this new information for a long time, and she notices her anger starting to shift into something else. The rage is still there, but it turns into a mix of grief and a strange kind of gratitude for Richard's foresight. He was careful, he was intentional, and in the end, he really did leave her the keys to everything. Then, she makes a choice that will end up costing her more than she ever imagined. She decides to tell Julian about the vault because she believes that being transparent is the right thing to do for the family. She thinks that if she is honest about the discovery, they will finally understand why Richard acted the way he did. She truly hopes that seeing his final wishes written in his own hand will actually mean something to his own flesh and blood. But the moment the words leave her mouth, Julian's face transforms into something cold and calculating. He doesn't offer a hug or a word of surprise, and instead, he contacts a high-priced lawyer that very same afternoon. Within a week, Sofia is served with legal papers informing her that she is being sued by her own family. Julian claims the vault, and everything inside of it should be split up according to standard estate law. He tells the court that Richard's property belongs to everyone, and he even suggests that Sofia might have forged the letter or planted the vault herself. He stands in front of the world and calls her a liar, just so he can get his hands on a piece of the inheritance. The legal battle that follows is absolutely brutal and drains Sofia of every bit of energy she has left. Her lawyer is sharp and stays focused on the facts, eventually getting a handwriting expert to prove the letter was authentic. They even find the original construction permits for the vault buried deep in Richard's old office files. He had built the room legally and documented the entire process, so on paper, everything Sofia said was the absolute truth. But in a courtroom, being right doesn't always mean the fighting stops, especially when your family is determined to tear you down. Months drag by as Sofia is forced to take time off work to attend endless meetings and uncomfortable depositions. She has to sit just a few feet away from Julian's lawyer while he politely implies that she is nothing more than a common thief. When the case finally goes to court, Sofia stands up and testifies about the letter and Richard's lifelong obsession with saving things. She explains that the 25 years of silence finally make sense now that she sees what he was protecting. She tells the judge that the vault isn't just a pile of money, but a massive responsibility that she was chosen to carry. The judge eventually picks up Richard's letter and reads the entire thing aloud to the silent courtroom. When he reaches the final word, even Julian's lawyer doesn't have anything left to say. Sofia wins the case, and the vault is legally declared hers once and for all. Sofia stands alone in the vault with the keys in her hand, looking at the life-changing choice sitting right in front of her. She could easily sell every single one of those gems because the documentation is perfect and the market is ready. She could have the money in her account by next month and pay off all the debts she piled up during the lawsuit. She could buy a beautiful house and live a comfortable life for the next 10 years without ever having to clock into a job again. It would mean security, it would mean peace, and it would finally move her out of Richard's long shadow. She could also choose to keep the seeds as a trophy, to remind herself that she won the battle against her family. They could stay in the dark as proof that Richard loved her in his own broken way, even if he couldn't say it out loud. She could lock the door and keep the vault as a private shrine to a man who spent his life keeping secrets from her. But she knows deep down that isn't what she is supposed to do with this gift. She calls the botanist back and makes an offer that leaves the woman on the other end of the phone speechless. Sofia decides to donate every single seed to the preservation network so they can be studied and replanted. Every jar, every specimen, and every extinct plant that Richard spent his life hiding is going back to the world where it belongs. The organization sends a team of specialists who treat every single jar like it is made of solid gold. Sofia stands back and watches them work as they carefully document and pack away the seeds that represent a future that almost didn't happen. Watching them, she finally realizes that Richard wasn't protecting treasure or property at all. He was protecting possibility. And now, those possibilities are finally going to have a chance to grow. She decides to keep the gems, but she doesn't use them to buy a fancy car or a new wardrobe. Instead, she uses the money to fund a total restoration of the old, rotting greenhouse. She hires a team of contractors to rebuild the entire glass structure from the ground up with new frames and crystal-clear panes. Sofia is there every single day to watch the progress and make sure that every tiny detail is handled with care. When the work is finally finished, the sunlight pours through the glass exactly the way it was always meant to. The space feels clean. It feels bright, and for the first time in decades, it feels alive. She starts planting new seeds in the restored greenhouse, but she doesn't pick anything rare or difficult to grow. She chooses simple things like tomatoes, fresh basil, and bright wildflowers that make her smile when she walks through the door. She mixes the soil with her own 2 hands and waters the sprouts every morning while talking to them the way Richard taught her so long ago. The vault is still there, climate-controlled and perfectly documented, serving as a quiet reminder of what was saved. Sofia spends almost every afternoon in that greenhouse now, with her hands in the dirt and the warm sun on her face. The space that used to be forbidden is now hers to define, and it isn't a dark sanctuary for Richard anymore. It is her own sanctuary, a place where things are allowed to grow out in the open. She still thinks about Richard all the time, and she is still angry at him for the years of silence and the secrets. He made her choose between her love for him and her own identity, and that is a wound that might never fully heal. But she is also deeply grateful for the seeds, the vault, and the fact that he trusted her with the keys. Both of those feelings live inside her at the same time, and as she watches her garden grow, she realizes that is exactly how it's supposed to be. Subscribe to see justice served in the next story. Sofia stands inside the restored greenhouse with her hands deep in the fresh soil, while warm sunlight pours through the clean glass panes above her. This forbidden space finally belongs to her, and the inheritance no one wanted became the bridge between a father's long silence and a daughter's new understanding. If you want to see what happens when hidden legacies finally come to light, subscribe, because this story isn't over.